we'll officially get going. Good evening. Thank you for joining us. We're thrilled to see we're at 60 people at this point coming in. It's exciting to have so many of you here. I'm Steve Shields. I'm a vice president of the Royal Asiatic Society. And on behalf of our president, Brother Anthony, and the council, I welcome you to the 1428th lecture since we began in 1900. The Royal Asiatic Society traces its beginnings to India in the late 1700s and was formally organized in London in the early 1800s. The Royal Asiatic Society of Great Britain granted the Korea branch a charter in 1900. RAS Korea expresses sincere thanks to our generous sponsor, Asia Development Foundation, for their second year of support. We also thank our members who have paid their annual dues. Your dues provide essential primary funding for RAS Korea, and we appreciate your continued support. There is those in attendance tonight who have not yet paid their membership fee for this year are invited to do so. If you are not a member, you're invited to join. See our website at raskb.com for details. If you are a guest tonight, we beg a one-time contribution of 10,000 won, or 10 US dollars or equivalent in other currency. Full-time students can contribute half of that amount. You can see on the main screen the page that gives you the PayPal or bank transfer information. If you're not in Korea, PayPal works best. Koreans are commonly used to using bank transfers, so that's usually not difficulty. Tonight, we're delighted to have Dale Quarrington with us. He will examine a collection of both historical and modern temples to help elucidate some of the uniqueness and diversity that are present in Korean Buddhist temples. He'll look at artistic and architectural features and talk about some of the symbolic meanings. Dale was born and raised in Canada. He's lived in South Korea off and on since 2003. He says he's traveled to over 500 temples throughout the Korean Peninsula. I understand there's about 900 traditional temples and another few thousand more modern type temples. So there's plenty of temples to look at. After Dale's presentation, we'll have time for questions. So if you will please mute your mics, and so that'll help reduce the background noise. We'll turn the time to Dale. Go ahead, Dale.
Hey, thank you very much for having me. I've long been a fan, but because I live down here in the provinces, down here in Gyeongnam, on a Tuesday evening, it's a bit hard to get up to Seoul. And also I want to thank everyone for taking their time and coming out and watching this lecture. So without further ado, I'm going to see if this works, my PPT. I hope it does. There we go.
It should. Yeah, it looks like, yep, here we go.
Yep, we're seeing it? Okay.
Very good.
All right, I'm going to get rid of my face and just let the PPT take over. There we go. All right, so Korean Buddhist temples, whether they're historic or modern, have a uniqueness all their own. And whether it's through their artwork, architecture, or history, this originality is always present. And yet you'll often hear, whether it's in person or online through blogs or websites, that all Korean Buddhist temples look the same. And perhaps in a macro structural sense, they do have a certain commonality, but more often than not, this idea usually arises either from a misconception or from a simple lack of understanding of the more than 12,000 Korean Buddhist temples that dot the Korean Peninsula. To use an analogy, it would be like walking into the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam, and right before seeing his sunflower paintings, you close your eyes and complain that all paintings look the same. This misses out on the vibrancy, the color, and the intensity of the artistry. Much is the same with Korean Buddhist temples or hermitages, whether it's inside or outside the temple shrine halls, the paintings, the stone masonry. There's subtle and not so subtle differences found in the temples. And it's in these details that one better understands and appreciates the symbolism, beauty, and brilliance of Korean Buddhist temples. So this lecture is going to be divided into two parts. The first part is going to be more of like a historical Korean Buddhist temples and the uniqueness that's there in historical temples. And then the second part will be a more modern, contemporary look at temples that are probably only about 100 years old and have a different reinterpretation of old themes and motifs. So, part one, to appreciate and understand the diversity and symbolism that creatively inhabits all Korean Buddhist temples, the best place to start is at a Korean temple shrine. In total, there are potentially 24 shrine halls that can take up residency at a temple. And while I won't cover all of them, I will cover the ones that are more popular with Koreans and tend to have more diversity. In total, and at larger temples, a Korean Buddhist temple can potentially have 5 entry gates. They are in order the Iljimun Gate, the Gumgang Moon Gate, the Chunhwang or Sachunwang Moon Gate, the Bulimun Gate, and the Bojeru Pavilion. But because of time constraints, I won't be able to talk about all 5. Instead, I'm just going to talk about one, the Chunhwang Moon Gate. And the reason why I'm focusing on this one specifically is because it does have the most diversity and creativity. So the Chunhwang Moon Gate means Heavenly King's Gate, or if it's called a Sachunwang Moon Gate, it's called the Four Heavenly Kings Gate in English. And inside the gate, there are 4 heavenly kings, like the gate kind of gives away with its name, that have intimidating stares, bulging eyes, and gnashing teeth. These 4 figures represent the 4 heavenly kings that are in Hindu in origin. They are said to stand in the 4 cardinal directions on Mount Sumeru, and they serve King Sakra. King Sakra resides on the summit of this mighty mountain in a palace called the Palace of Correct Views. This area, at least according to ancient Buddhist cosmology, is the center of the universe. And according to the same ancient Buddhist cosmology belief, the 4 heavenly kings stand approximately 750 feet in height, and they lived for 9 million years. At one point, they are said to have helped Siddhartha Gautama, who became the Buddha, or Sakyamuni Bull in Korean, to leave his father's house and ultimately renounce all things worldly. The reason that the Chunhwang Moon Gate, or the Heavenly King's Gate in English, is placed where it is to protect Buddhism and Buddhist teachings from the evil spirits. The 4 heavenly kings were placed inside the Chunhwang Gate after they had embraced the Buddhist teachings and vowed to defend them. And the reason they look as ferocious as they do inside their gate is that they are forcing unruly spirits to submit to their will. And for those that are unwilling to submit to their will, the 4 heavenly kings simply trample these opponents under feet. So their ferociousness encourages people to bow to them and to rid visitors of their bad thoughts or misdeeds. If your mind is not peaceful and pure enough to enter the land, Pure Land, which is in the inner sanctuary of the temple grounds, then they might not let you enter. In fact, if you look down at the feet of the 4 heavenly kings, you'll see demons that look like government officials, foreign soldiers, or just plain demons being trampled underfoot. As for how the 4 heavenly kings are represented, then they can either appear as 4 large statues, which is more common in larger temples, or they can appear as 4 murals that hang inside of the gate. The first of the 4, and their leader, is Damun Chunwang. To identify him, you should move counterclockwise, and you'll see the cardinal directions of the west, Gwangmok Chunwang, the south, Jungjang Chunwang, and the east, Jiguk Chunwang. Damun Chunwang guards the north. Damun Chunwang is one that holds a pagoda in his hand. The pagoda symbolizes a stupa, which is a reminder of death and spirituality. The second heavenly king is Jungjang Chunwang. He holds a sword in his hand and guards the south. He is said to have power to multiply his swords so that he can always outnumber his opponents. The third heavenly king is Jiguk Chunwang, who holds a lute in his hands and protects the east. With the strings of the lute, he controls the weather, like the wind, thunder, lightning, and hail, all the great weather. The fourth and final heavenly king is Gwangmok Chanwang, who is the guardian of the West, and he holds a dragon in one hand and a jewel in the other. Originally, however, there was no hard and fast rules regarding which king held which object. Two great examples of this can be found at Sakuram Hermitage in Gyeongju and Songgwangsa Temple in Suncheon, Jeollanam-do. Concerning the example of Sakuram Hermitage, 3 of the 4 kings are holding swords, and Damun Chanwang is holding a pagoda. In fact, the 4 heavenly kings' appearance varied between Goryeo and Joseon-style paintings. Over time, the objects became a lute, a dragon, a sword, and a pagoda. This standard was established by the Yuan dynasty and the Ming dynasty in China, and the Joseon dynasty followed. However, at some temples, these items and names of the 4 heavenly kings were mislabeled. For example, at Songgwangsa Temple, which is the picture we're looking at, Damun Chanwang is holding a lute instead of a pagoda. Jingjiang Chanwang is holding a dragon, Jiguk Chanwang is holding a sword, and Gwamok Chanwang is holding the pagoda-like staff. These clay statues were they are Korean treasure, number 1467, and they were recast in 1628 after being destroyed in the Imjin War in 1597, which explains the differences. And just recently, I actually discovered at Tongdosa Temple as well, that they've been mislabeled as well. The Heavenly King's Gate at Tongdosa actually is a bit later than Songgwangsa, but just like it, they've also mislabeled the 4 heavenly kings. So a bit interesting that even though I've visited so many temples, and I've been to Tongdosa Temple probably 100 times, I still find new things to discover. So the next hall we're going to look at is the Daeungjeon, which is the Great Hero Hall. And it's the central main hall at a Korean Buddhist temple. The diversity at a Buddhist temple comes from Korean shamanism as well as Mahayana Buddhism. Within Mahayana Buddhism, there are literally hundreds of Buddhas who are fully enlightened beings and bodhisattvas, enlightened beings who through compassion forgo nirvana in order to help save other beings. And while Mahayana Buddhism has hundreds of Buddhas and bodhisattvas, the Korean form of Mahayana Buddhism usually only worships a select few. The central figure to Buddhism in Korea is Sakyamuni Buddha. Inside the Daeungjeon sits a centrally located statue of Sakyamuni Buddha, and he's usually accompanied by a bookend of either Buddhas or bodhisattvas. As a rule, the Daeungjeon is centrally located inside the temple complex, and sitting in the central location on the main altar is Sakyamuni Buddha. The way that you can identify Sakyamuni is through his mudra, or ritual gesture, which in Korean is called a suin. Actually, Sakyamuni Buddha can be identified through a few mudras, but the most common is the calling the earth to witness, like in the picture here from Sakuram. The mudra recalls the story about Buddha just before he gained enlightenment. He was challenged by Mara about his authority. The Buddha called the earth to witness his many good deeds and actions in his past lives, thus justifying his authority. The way that this mudra is physically expressed is through a seated Buddha. As he is seated, Sakyamuni Buddha has his right hand hanging over his right knee with his palm turned inwards. Meanwhile, the left hand is still resting on his lap. Sometimes the index finger of the right hand will point to the earth. So, flanking the seated statue of Sakyamuni Buddha and housed inside the Daeungjeon Hall are 2 bodhisattvas. The first, or bosal in Korean, the first one to the left is typically Munsu Bosal, who is the bodhisattva of wisdom. Like some other bodhisattvas, he wears a large golden crown. Also, Munsu Bosal can either be holding a sword or a trident in his hands. The other bodhisattva that sits on the Daeungjeon main altar is Bohyang Bosal, who's the bodhisattva of power. And Bohyang Bosal represents the teaching, meditation, and practice of the Buddha. In a jeweled hall of the Great Hero, which is another name for the Daeungjeon, the central statues remains Sakyamuni Buddha, and he's accompanied by different, not bodhisattvas, but Buddhas. And the first is Amita Buddha, who is the Buddha of the Western Paradise, and Yaksa Yore Buddha, the medicine Buddha, as well as the Buddha of the Eastern Paradise. This triad is a manifestation of the reality of life and samsara, which is the cycle of life, sickness, death, life, sickness, death. From sunrise in the east with Yaksa Yore Buddha, to life with Sakyamuni Buddha, to death in the west with the setting of the sun with Amita Buddha. A great physical representation of this can be found in the lower courtyard of Tongdosa Temple with, from left to right, and you can see in the upper picture in the presentation, of the Yaksajun on the left, the Yongsanjun, which is Vulture Peak, and it's dedicated to Sakamani Bull, and the Guknakjun Hall, which is dedicated to Amita Bull. Another triad may be housed inside Daengjun. Like other two triadic formations, Sakamani Bull is joined by two Buddhas again. This time it's Yeondeung Bull, the past Buddha, and Miruk Bull, the future Buddha. And one last triad is the one where you find in the middle Sakamani Bull again, and he's joined by Jijang, who's the Bodhisattva of the afterlife on the left, and Gwansan Bosal, the Bodhisattva of compassion on the right. So inside the Daengjun, these are just a couple examples. The wooden altar that the triad sits upon is called a Sumidan in Korean, and this altar represents the peak of the mythological Mount Sumeru, which is the peak where the Buddha is enthroned. It's from this peak that the Buddha emits his light of compassion and wisdom. As for the rest of the hall, it's almost always the most ornate hall in the temple. As for the exterior, you can sometimes see on the upper portion is what we call the shimudo, which are the ox herding murals, and they're used in Sun Buddhism or Zen, which in the West we more commonly know, and it's the journey towards enlightenment. And the bottom ones are just the flowers that you can see as well, which are kind of thought of as flowers from heaven, which are recorded in scripture, Buddhist scripture. And also you can sometimes see the dragon ship of wisdom. And in Buddhism, these two dragons at the bottom you can see popping out near the tablet of the name of the main hall is actually a symbol of the dragon ship of wisdom, which ferries the faithful to the Pure Land of paradise. In total, there are 3 national treasures that are Daengjung halls in Korea. There are the Daengjung at Sudaksa Temple, Tongdosa Temple, and Bongjongsa Temple in Andong. For the sake of this presentation, I'm only going to be looking at the main hall at Tongdosa Temple, Daengjun, which is national treasure number 290, and it was built in 1645. Instead of housing a solitary statue of Sakamani Bull on the main altar, or even in a triad of statues, there's a window on the main altar that looks out onto the Gumgang-gedan, or the diamond altar in English. In the center of the Gumgang-gedan is a stone lotus bud. Housed inside the stone lotus bud are the partial remains of the Buddha. The remains were brought back to Korea by Jajang Yulsa and housed at Tongdosa Temple, which he built in 646 AD to house these relics. The presence of the Buddha's remains are meant to symbolize that the Buddha is always with us, and instead of being symbolically present through statues or paintings, the Buddha is actually physically with us. The corners of the stone altar are adorned with 4 heavenly kings, and you can also see other decorative things like bichun, which are flying heavenly deities that praise the Buddha. Throughout the years, it's been repaired and fixed, I think 7 times in total. Another interesting aspect of the Daengjun at Tongdosa is that there are actually 4 name plaques above the 4 entries of the Daengjun. Above the eastern entrance is Daengjun, which is self-explanatory. The next is a Daebang Gwangjun, which is another name for the main hall. The south side says Gumgang-gedan, self-explanatory again. And the north side, which faces out towards the Gumgang-gedan, is Jokmyeol Bogung, which is a reference to the 5 historical temples that house the Sari, crystallized remains of the Buddha, as founded by Jajang Yulsa. So the next hall we're going to be looking at is the Mirukjan Hall, and it houses the future Buddha, Mirukpo, and he will return to Earth in 5.67 billion years after the death of the historical Buddha. So Mirukpo is seen as both a Buddha and a Bodhisattva, which can sometimes be a bit confusing when you visit a temple and see Mirukpo or Mirukposal or vice versa. They are one and the same, just at different stages of their spiritual journey. Mirukpo is next in long line of Buddhas, much like Sakamani Bull, the Buddha we know, Until then, Mirukpo resides in his heaven as Bodhisattva. Currently, he passes his time teaching heavenly beings prior to attaining his Buddhahood because he's waiting for a long time. You'll see there's one very famous statue in Korea that Mirukpo, or Bosal at this time, looks very contemplative. He has his elbow on his lap and his hand below his chin. And this is why, because he's waiting to become a Buddha. As for Mirukjan Hall, where Mirukpo commonly takes up residence at a Korean Buddhist temple, it can also be called the Yonghwajan Hall. Yonghwa means dragon flower hall in English. This connection to a dragon might seem a bit confusing at first. However, according to tradition, when Mirukpo Sal returns to earth as Mirukpo, he will attain his Buddhahood under a dragon flower tree. Dragons are thought to have a countless amount of scales on their body, which is a symbol of the infinite. It's also symbolic of a dragon's immeasurable power. Another connection to the dragon that Mirukpo has is that it's believed that he turned into a dragon spirit as he entered into his meditative state while waiting to become a Buddha. This also ties into the dragon's ability as a shapeshifter to appear in a number of forms to help people towards the Pure Land, or Jongto in Korean. People pray to Mirukpo for two reasons. One is for Mirukpo to come earlier, and the second is so that devotees can be reborn as Mirukpo's presence. There are wonderful examples of Mirukpo in Korea, like at Gwanchoksa and Gumsansa and Bapjusa, but the one that I'll be focusing on is the Yonghwajan Hall at Tongdosa. What's especially unique about the Yonghwajan Hall is the alms bowl pagoda that stands out in front of it. The name of the alms bowl pagoda is called a Bong Bal Tap in Korean. It's often called the robe and bowl tower, as it houses the actual robe and alms bowl of the historical Buddha, Sakyamuni bowl. So this is also, the pagoda is Korean treasure number 471, and it's packed with symbolic meaning. The Buddha's robe and bowl are regarded as symbols of the Buddha's teachings being handed down to teachers and their disciples. The Buddha's artifacts and remains, again, were brought to Tongdosa by Jajangyosa. Structurally, the alms bowl pagoda appears on a long pillar to support the lotus pedestal. On top of the pedestal is placed a stone bowl with a lid. It's believed that the alms bowl pagoda dates back to the Goryeo dynasty. However, there is some dispute as to when it was built because it appears as though the pedestal and the bowl are still stylistically different. So next hall we're going to be looking at is the Gwanamjun. This is perhaps the most popular shrine hall at Korean temples outside the Daemungjun main hall. The Gwanamjun Hall is a hall dedicated to Gwansan Bosal, the Bodhisattva of compassion. Compassion in this sense is often associated in Korean Buddhism with the unconditional love of a mother. This hall is typically packed with worshipers all hours of the day and days of the week and weeks of the month and months of the year. It's just absolutely packed. Gwansan Bosal means the hearer of cries in English. Gwansan Bosal was born from a ray of light from Amitabha's right eye. As a result of her origins, Gwansan Bosal is closely associated with Amitabha. In fact, Gwansan Bosal is thought to be the Bodhisattva incarnation of Amitabha. As for Gwansan Bosal's appearance, she's one of the easier figures to identify in Korean Buddhism for a couple reasons. The first is that the very sex of Gwansan Bosal in Korea is female, but in India is male. So you can sometimes see like a little tiny mustache. And this is a bit of a giveaway as to what she looks like. But perhaps the most common representation of Gwansan Bosal is the 1,000 hands and eyes. These hands and eyes are used to reach out to those in need. In addition to these hands and eyes, Gwansan Bosal can also have 9 or 11 heads, which represents her all-knowing and understanding acceptance of nature. In her 11-headed incarnation, the 3 heads to the left signify anger, while the 3 to the right have a serene smile. The 3 heads to the back bear an expression of compassion, while the largest one to the front exudes a balance of serenity. The 11th and final head at the very back is laughing, which is a sign of her wisdom. However, Gwansan can also be depicted in 33 different forms. These 33 different forms exist so as to help save sentient beings from the different needs. With this in mind, other ways Gwansan can appear is either seated or standing. She can also be holding any number of objects. And she often appears with Yongwang, which you can see in this picture, who is the Dragon King. In temples where Gwansan Bosal is the central image inside the main hall is called the Wontangjan, which means passing through with ease. This refers to the idea that Gwansan Bosal has the power to get by any difficulty, so a person should pray for her blessings. Specifically, you can see great examples of this at Bapjusa Temple and Heungjongsa Temple in Haeundae-gu in Busan. Here are some great examples of it. The far left is Naksansa Temple, and in the middle is Haedong-yonggungsa in Busan, and on the right is Girumsa Temple in Gyeongju. These are all great examples of Gwansan Bosal. But what we're going to specifically look at is the one at Songgwangsa Temple. Originally, the Gwanamjeon Hall at Songgwangsa Temple was built in 1903, and it was called the Seongsujeon Hall. It was used as an imperial prayer hall for the Emperor Gwangmu, or King Gojong of Joseon, in 1903. And in 1903, King Gojong was celebrating his 51st birthday, so he gave a plaque to adorn the hall. In 1957, the former Gwanamjeon Hall was dismantled at Songgwangsa Temple and was moved to its current location, and the Seongsujeon Hall was renamed and called the Gwanamjeon Hall. The statue of Gwansan Bosal inside this hall is from 1662, and interestingly enough, in the inside of it, you can see who actually funded it, because the name of the lady that funded it appears inside, and it was dedicated for the health and longevity of Prince Gyeongan and his wife. This hall is beautifully surrounded on all sides by lush gardens. Sitting all alone inside this hall is a statue of Gwansan Bosal. The statue is surrounded by the sun. I'll show back. You can see the sun and the moon, which are meant to represent the emperor and his empress. There are also civil vassals bowing towards the altar. Another unique feature of the Gwanamjeon Hall at Songgwangsa Temple is that there are landscapes and paintings both inside and outside the shrine hall. Okay, the next hall we're going to talk about is the Myeongbujeon Hall, which is another very popular shrine hall at Korean Buddhist temples. And Myeongbujeon just simply means judgment hall in English. And it's meant to symbolize a dark court or underworld where the souls of the dead are being judged. The judgment hall is one of the more unique looking buildings at a temple because of its gruesome depictions of the afterlife, the uplifting paintings of salvation, the ominous judges, and the serenely redemptive Jijang Bosal who appears in the center of this picture from Hungguksa Temple, Yosu Jolanamdo. So Jijang Bosal is committed to remain on earth until there are no more suffering souls in hell. Jijang Bosal was authorized by the Buddha, Sakyamuni Bull, to enlighten all sentient beings by delivering them from suffering caused during the vast time between the passing of Sakyamuni Bull and the future Buddha, Miruk Bull. Jijang Bosal, in his former life, saved his mother from the underworld through his fervent prayers and pious offerings. Also, he made vows to help relieve people from their suffering, especially those fated to suffer in the afterlife. A great example of this is the picture on the screen. You can see is Jijang Bosal, and he's in the depths of hell, and the fire almost looks like lava, and he's standing sturdy and helping those that are suffering in hell. And you can find this painting at Shinhungsa Temple in my hometown here in Korea of Yangsan, Gyeongsang, Namdo. So, Jijang Bosal is one of the easier Buddhas to identify. In fact, he's probably the easiest to identify because he has short cropped hair, black or green. In his right hand, he typically holds a monk's staff with 6 rings attached to the top. The monk's staff is used for opening the doors to the afterlife. In his left hand, Jijang Bosal holds a pearl or a wish-fulfilling gem. This pearl can do a couple of things. First, it can light up the darkest depths of hell or the afterlife. Secondly, it grants wishes to selfless individuals. Jijang Bosal is typically joined on the main altar of the Myeongbujeon by Mudokgwi Wang, the king of ghosts who purifies people's minds, and Master Daoming, who is known as the returned soul because he came back from the underworld to help others. As for the main altar, which houses Jingjiang Bosal, it's typically surrounded by the 10 kings of the underworld, which you can see in the picture, which are called Shiwang in Korean. In Buddhism, not all souls go to the underworld and they're not damned. Instead, each person that dies will first find their way to the proper underworld courtroom to be judged. A karma mirror called a upgyeongdae in Korean is held up to a deceased person, and all their good and bad deeds are reflected to their spirit. Paintings of these scenes are a reminder of the consequences of a person's actions while they live. The categories of judgment for the deceased are murder, lying, corruption, theft, lack of filial piety, failing to help others, and sexual misconduct. As for the kings, they are usually statues, and then they can either be seated on the thrones or standing. The exterior of the Myeongbujeon can be just as, if not more elaborate than the interior. While typically smaller in stature and understated, the hall more than makes up for it with its artwork. Almost always, this hall is adorned with gruesome set of grotesque paintings, people being judged and punished in the afterlife. These paintings, as a result of their originality and creativity, can be amongst the finest at any temple or hermitage. Some great examples of this style of artwork adorning exterior walls of Myeongbujeon Hall can be found at Yongjusa Temple and Songnimsa Temple in Chilgok, Gyeongsangbuk-do. You can see in the painting people being boiled alive, having their tongues pulled out, bitterly cold, flayed, tormented by poisonous snakes, lying on a bed of metal spikes, impaled, and just generally not having a great time. The Myeongbujeon Hall at these temples are like a Buddhist version of Dante's Inferno. And next up, in the last part of the first part, and this should make, I hope, David Mason very happy, is Sanshin, which is the mountain spirit, who is a shaman deity. At a Korean Buddhist temple, you can also find a shaman shrine hall. They can be collectively put together at a Samsonggak, which is known as a Three Saints Shrine in English, or they can individually appear, like at a Sanshinggak, the Mountain Spirit Hall, Doksanggak, the Lonely Saint Hall, or the Chilsonggak, which is the Seven Stars Hall. And finally, or you can have Yongwang, which is the Dragon King. So specifically, we're not going to talk about all of them. We're just going to talk about Sanshin. And Sanshin means mountain spirit in English, and mountains are worshipped all throughout Northern Asia, like in China, Japan, and Korea. According to these Northeastern peoples, the reason that mountains are worshipped as venerated objects is that they symbolize a central axis to the world. What this means is that a mountain is believed to be a place that connects heaven and earth. And with the Korean landscape being over 70% mountains, it makes sense as to why Koreans, both historically and presently, worship their mountains. Historically, Koreans prayed to mountains in Sanshin for good weather, a bountiful harvest, good health, and good fortune. When Buddhism finally did enter the Korean Peninsula in the 4th century, Buddhism showed deference to the shaman deities that were figures of original worship throughout the Korean Peninsula. Shamanic beliefs were absorbed not only as respectful, but they also did this to curry favor from the locals that continued to worship shaman deities like Sanshin. In Korea, there are literally thousands of different images and incarnations of Sanshin. However, with that being said, Sanshin does tend to exhibit specific characteristics that are common to most Sanshin images. Usually, Sanshin is depicted as a seated figure, just as typically he's an old man with long flowing white hair. His white hair is matched by flowing white beard, and even though he's old, he still looks strong and healthy. In a painting, he's situated in pastoral setting that is perfect for meditation. Typically, he's joined by any number of attendants known as dongja. The clothes that he wears are regal looking. Almost always, Sanshin will hold something either in one or both hands, like a fan or a walking stick, which symbolizes health, longevity, virility, or spiritual attainment. But perhaps the easiest way to identify the shaman deity is that Sanshin is almost always joined by at least one tiger. Just like Sanshin is the king of the mountain, so too is the tiger the king of the mountain animals, and the tiger acts as Sanshin's enforcer. Predominantly, Sanshin appears as a male, but this wasn't always the case. It wasn't until the Confucian-dominated Joseon dynasty that this took place. Previously, it was very common for Sanshin to be female, like at Sangesa Temple in Jirisan or Nojanam Hermitage in Yangsan, Gyeongsangnam-do. Far less common is to see a combination of both a male and female Sanshin together, like at Bapjusa Temple and Ilbungsa Temple. And perhaps the rarest of all is the Sanshin at Hongjeam Hermitage on the Haensa Temple grounds in Hapcheon, Gyeongsangnam-do. Sanshin appears as a bodhisattva, which further blurs the boundaries between Buddhism and shamanism in Korea, and it also elevates Sanshin as an elevated being from which a devotee can learn, like from Gwansan Bosal or Munso Bosal, and not just as a symbol of health and longevity. All right, now we're going to shift to the more contemporary part of the lecture, and these temples reinterpret old traditional paintings or shrine halls in a more contemporary sense. And the first of these temples is Samjeongsa Temple in Hamyang, Gyeongsangnam-do, which is in northern Jirisan. And they reinterpret the Guknakjeon Hall, which is for Amitabha. So first, what is a Guknakjeon Hall? Well, a Guknakjeon Hall is dedicated to Amitabha, the Buddha of the Western Paradise. Amitabha is a transliteration of the Sanskrit Amitabha, which means immeasurable life in English. Amitabha is the overseer of the Western Pure Land, or Jongto in Korean. This idea is rooted in the very name of the Gukrakjeon, which means Paradise Hall in English. The hall also goes by a couple other names like Mitajeon, Muryangsujeon, and probably the most famous is at Busaksa Temple in Yeongju, Gyeongsangnam-do. And the Muryangsujeon means immeasurable life hall, which is another parallel, a hat tip to Amitabha. So Amitabha is one of the easier Buddhas to identify at Korean Buddhist temples. The way this is done is through the suin in Korean, mudra in English, which is a ritualized hand gesture. In Amitabha's mudra, the right hand is held upwards and the left hand is turned down. What this symbolizes is the mudra of fearlessness. What this mudra means is the ability to shed one's anxieties while being led towards wisdom. Another mudra that Amitabha displays, and probably the more common one, is the mudra of almost like an OK gesture. This, which you can see in this picture, kind of from Bulguksa Temple. This mudra symbolizes the turning of the wheel mudra. So, how does this all relate to Samjeongsa Temple? The Gukrakjeon Hall at Samjeongsa is a hybrid between a cave shrine hall, like at Sakuram Hermitage in Gyeongju, or the Gunwi Grotto in Gunwi, Gyeongsangnam-do, Gyeongsangbuk-do, while also exhibiting the features of the very popular Seokbulsa Temple in Bukgu, Busan. So first, Samjeongsa Temple was built over a 30-year process, starting in 1989. The temple is most famous for the Gukrakjeon Cave Shrine Hall. The cave was built to appease the vengeful spirits that were killed during the Korean War. Purportedly, this part of the mount of Jirisan has a horrible history related to the Korean War. When the head monk was traveling through this part of the mountain, he heard the cries of a lot of the dead spirits that lost their lives during the Korean War. He started to pray here for them, where the present Samjeongsa Temple is located. It took about 10 years to build the cave shrine hall, which is called the Seokgulbapdang from 1989. And the cave shrine hall is meant to look like an ideal world, the Pure Land of Buddhism. So here's a look inside. When you look around the interior of the Gukrak Cave Shrine Hall at Samjeongsa Temple, first you'll notice that every square inch is covered in stone reliefs. Upon closer inspection, you'll notice the main altar is occupied by a 2-meter tall relief of Amitabha that's on the left. This relief is joined on either side by standing reliefs of Gwansan Bosal and Deseji Bosal. There are swirls of heavenly clouds at the base of these reliefs, and to the left is the equally large altar with a relief of Jijang Bosal, the Bodhisattva of the afterlife. This relief sits upon a stone lotus pedestal, and Jijang Bosal is joined by Mudokgui Wang and Master Daoming on either side, like he traditionally is. And filling out the rest of the interior of the masterful Shinjung Tenghua, which is a shaman guardian, traditionally mural, Bichun, which are flying heavenly deities that praise the Buddha, with their musical instruments, and agui, which are hungry spirits that torment the dead. And they're all under a rich canopy of heavenly flowers. So the next temple we're going to talk about is Daewonsa Temple in Pohang, Gyeongsang-bukdo. And this is a reinterpretation of the dragon at a Korean Buddhist temple. So unlike the Western idea of dragons, which are thought to be destructive and harmful, dragons in Korea are thought to be a sign of good luck. In appearance, they have deer antlers, a snake belly, a fish tail, claws, whiskers. Originally, when the dragon first came to China and then onto the Korean Peninsula, they were naga. Naga are half human and half cobra, semi-divine beings that are potentially dangerous, but they are helpful and beneficial to humans. Symbolically, dragons, which are known as yong or ryong in Korean, are thought to be bearers of good fortune and spiritual clarity. So there's, from my estimation, 7 ways that you can see dragons in around Korean Buddhist temples. The first, number 1, is the dragon ship of wisdom, which symbolically ferries the dead across samsara towards the Pure Land, or Jongto. The second is a temple shrine hall, which has dragon heads protruding out from the surfaces of the eaves to symbolically represent the dragon ship of wisdom. The third is the underside of a temple entry bridge, like at Sonamsa Temple. And the bridge's name is the Sungsun-gyo Bridge, and it's to ward off evil spirits. The next is the crowning of the bell, the temple bell, and you'll see a dragon, and this is called Pore, and Pore is afraid of whales, so he helps make a temple bell sound louder with his cries, because the striker that hits the bell is traditionally a whale. Another one is for dragons is Mirukbo and Yonghwajeon, which I explained, and the sixth is the icons of Yonghwan, and number 7 is the main altar's Datjib, and you can see in picture number 3. So, Daewonsa Temple. And what does this have to do with Daewonsa Temple and the dragon? Well, first, a little background on the temple. Before Daewonsa Temple was built, it was a site occupied by a much older temple, but according to a local legend, it was dismantled to become barracks for the military. As for the present temple, Daewonsa Temple, it was reconstructed in 1945, just after the Japanese colonization of Korea came to an end. As for the reinterpretation of the symbol of the dragon at Daewonsa, it's quite immediate. There's a 100-meter long blue dragon that snakes its way from the lower courtyard up the mountain to where the new Daeongjung Main Hall is located. The blue color of the dragon represents how highly protective it is. Furthermore, you can even enter through the mouth of the dragon and pass the red medicine ball tonsil, which actually I revisited and the tonsil is gone, so I'm not sure where it went, but you can still go through the mouth. And as you go through the mouth and you enter in through the throat of the dragon, you'll make your way down the corridor towards the former main hall at Daewonsa Temple, the Daejokgwangjun. So you metaphorically and physically enter into the belly of the dragon to where the shrine hall is situated. The Dharma is well protected in the life-size dragon, and at the tail end of the giant, you'll find the Daeongjung new main hall. The dragon is all-encompassing at Daewonsa Temple, and nothing is out of reach for the blue dragon. The grounds of the temple are well protected by the modern twist that is Daewonsa Temple. So next up is Sonjisa, which is located in Gimhae, Gyeongsangnam-do. And what we're going to be looking at is the Yongsanjeon Hall, which is the main hall at Sonjisa. The name Yongsanjeon Hall means Vulture Peak Hall in English. The hall is meant to symbolically reenact the Buddha at Vulture Peak. And it's on Vulture Peak that the Buddha espouses his central ideas and teachings found in the Lotus Sutra. In the Lotus Sutra, which is regarded as one of the most important and influential sutras in Mahayana Buddhism, Sakyamuni Bull presents the ultimate truth of life. The central idea found in the Lotus Sutra is that Buddhahood, which is a supreme state in life, is characterized by compassion, wisdom, and courage. And most importantly, Buddhahood is inherent in all of us. And there's no limits based on intellectual ability, social standing, ethnicity, or gender. As for the Yongsanjeon Hall at Korean Buddhist temples, it traditionally houses 3 statues on the main altar. In the center, rather obviously, is Sakamuni Bull, the Buddha, and he's joined by Yeondong Bull, the past Buddha, and Miruk Bull, the future Buddha. Typically, the Yongsanjeon Hall is populated by one or two things. First, you can see that there are statues, 500 statues, like at the one at Gojoam Hermitage in Yeongcheon, Gyeongsangbuk-do, which is also National Treasure 14, or like paintings at Tongdosa Temple, which depict the 8 scenes from the Buddha's life, which are known as Palsangdo. So what exactly does Yongsanjeon Hall have to do with Sunjisa Temple? Well, first, Sunjisa was officially registered as a temple with the Korean government in 2007. The naming of Sunjisa Temple is based on a local town and a local pond. And before 2007, it's believed by some that the temple had just simply fallen into disrepair and abandoned. For nearly 30 years, though, this temple was nothing more than a tent that the head monk lived in. And finally, 2 lay bosals, or women that donate money, donate enough money to build Sunjisa Temple. So what's so important about the 500 statues? Maybe you can see in this painting, or sorry, in these statues with this picture, at the bottom, there's a figure that might seem familiar. And so the statues that make up residence inside the Yongsanjeon Hall at Sunjisa Temple, this is where things take a bit of a turn. Inside the Yongsanjeon Hall, you'll find such luminaries as Jangyu Hwasang, who is the Queen Ha's brother from Gaia, Wanhyo Desa, Uesang Desa, and Jesus, Hyangsang Jonja. According to the head monk at Sunjisa Temple, Jesus is the 109th Nahan. Nahan are the historical disciples of the Buddha. And Jesus' connection to the Nahan is through a temple in China. Supposedly, Jesus traveled to China, and by way of China, in the aforementioned Chinese temple, Jesus traveled to the Korean Peninsula and Sunjisa Temple in particular with a Nahan. This was on a Korean TV show, actually. A lot of this was covered on KBS. So what's specific about Jesus in Korea? Well, Jesus came to Korea to tell Koreans the message that we should live well together since the society we live in is multicultural and multi-religious. So the fourth of 5 temples that we'll be covering is Songdokam Hermitage. And specifically what they reinterpret is the Gamno-do, or the Sweet Dew mural in English. Songdokam Hermitage is a branch hermitage of the famous Bamosa Temple in Busan. The temple was built in 1933, and it was built for the well-being of local fishermen and townspeople, which makes sense because it's so close to the harbor. But it's the Gamno-do inside the main hall that's the focus of this specific presentation. So what is a Gamno-do painting? It's depicted from the Ulambana Sutra. Other names it goes by is the Gamno Wang or the Gamno Tenghwa. And it depicts the Pure Land, Chongto, and the Agui that are eating at those that are suffering, that are trying to get to the Pure Land. And the painting is traditionally divided into 3 parts, which you can see in these traditional paintings. The top consists of a centralized image of Amitabha, the Buddha of the Western Paradise, welcoming sentient beings into the Pure Land, alongside 5 or 7 other Buddhas. The Bodhisattvas in the mural that stands out with the flagpole is leading the dead towards the Pure Land as Gwansan Bosal and Jijang Bosal descend from the clouds. In the center section of the painting, you'll find 1 or 2 agui, hungry spirits, with a bulging belly, constricted throat, and pinhole mouth. They're typically fighting over food in front of an ancestral rites table. And on either side of the agui, you'll find monks performing the ceremony for the dead by chanting, ringing a handbell, cymbals, or striking the Dharma drum to help comfort the spirits of the dead. And in the lower section of the Gamno mural, you'll find realistic portrayals of the 6 realms of existence, which are hell, agui, animals, humans, asuras, which are large demons, and heavenly beings. And typically they're portrayed in kind of a Goryeo or Joseon era, which you can see in this painting at the bottom. So what makes the one different at Songdokam Hermitage in Gyeongsangnam-no? Well, It has 3 sections, just like a traditional one. The upper and central are exactly the same as a traditional one. However, where the one at Songdokam Hermitage diverges is in the bottom portion of the painting. Instead of realistically portraying the 6 realms of existence in some ancient or mythological recreation, it's firmly rooted in the past 50 years of world history. More precisely, instead of having people that might look like they inhabit a world around the Goryeo or Joseon dynasty time frame, we see images of those people that have shaped our world in the present, either good or bad. In the mural, rather remarkably, you'll see painted images of Osama bin Laden, George W. Bush, 9/11, the DMZ, the Vietnam War in the form of the famous picture of the national police chief of South Vietnam executing a Viet Cong fighter, the Gwangju uprising, and the famine in Africa during the 1980s. So the final temple we're going to talk about is Jaesoksa Temple in Gyeongsan, Gyeongsangbuk-do. And what it does is takes a modern interpretation of the Palsangdo, which are typically dedicated to the Buddha, Sakyamuni Buddha, and it reinterprets it for Wanyo Desa. And Wanyo Desa was actually born in Gyeongsang, which would make sense as to why this temple is there and representing Wanyo Desa. So first, the temple, Jaesoksa, was originally built around 400 years ago. A local farmer found a statue of the Buddha and a part of pagoda, so it was decided to build a temple on Jaesoksa Temple's current grounds. These historic artifacts are believed to date back to the later Shilla. Some people believe that Wanyo Desa built the original Jaesoksa Temple. However, there is no documentation proving this belief. According to the Samguk Yusa, Wanyo built temples both where he was born as well as where he lived. According to the Korean Temple History book, the main hall at Jaesoksa was built in 1962, while the neighboring Chilsonggak was built in 1965. As for the famous monk, Wanyo Desa, when he was 15 years old, he donated all his family's wealth and entered Buddhist holy orders to become a monk. He built his first temple called Chogesa Temple at his home, and he later built Jaesoksa beside a Sarasu tree, which is where he was born. He attempted to travel to Tang China with the monk Uisang Desa, who was a good friend, and on the way, they decided to sleep inside a cave. While he was sleeping, Wanyo became thirsty, so he reached his hand out towards a bucket of water in the dark. After he thought that the water was so good, the next day they woke up and realized that they were in fact inside a tomb, and the water that he drank from was from a skull. He had the sudden realization that, quote, all the phenomenon in this world are from your own mind, and every law is only realization or awareness. There is no other law beside your mind. Why would you look for other things? End quote. So he left Uisang, and Uisang continued on to Tang China, and Wanyo returned to the Shilla kingdom. So what does this all have to do with the Palsangdo? So, first, the Palsangdo murals are a collection of 8 murals that depict the Buddha's life from birth to death. And these murals can be found all throughout Korean Buddhist temples. They're about 2,000 years old, and they typically adorn the Daeongjeon Hall. So the first painting is the announcement of the imminent birth, which has a white elephant, which is a symbol of good luck in India, and Maya appears, who's the Buddha's mother, in a dream. The second painting, the second painting is the birth, and Buddha is born in Lumbini. He emerges from the side of his mother, and he's walking, and he's both well-developed and fully clothed. The third painting is the world outside the palace, and the third mural depicts the Buddha as older. Siddhartha Gautama is older, and he travels outside his father's palace. Then he encounters suffering, sickness, and death for the first time. In the fourth painting, which is called Renunciation, a white horse is painted with Siddhartha Gautama on top of it. Both are in flight over the palace walls. The fifth painting is called Asceticism. In the painting, Siddhartha has been studying and meditating to find the truth for the past 6 years. In the sixth painting, called Temptation, Mara is attempting to break Siddhartha's meditation and ultimate enlightenment by tempting Siddhartha with Mara's 3 daughters, desire, lust, and aversion. The seventh painting in the set is called Enlightenment, and it depicts Siddhartha Gautama having gained enlightenment and become the Buddha. In this painting, he has his disciples at his feet and he preaches to them in Deer Park. And in the 8th painting and final painting called Death, it depicts the Buddha having died at the age of 80. The Buddha lies on his right side as a collection of earthly and celestial creatures gather around him. As for Jaesaksa and Wanyo Desa and the Palsangdo murals, they all come together neatly inside the Wanyo Sangsajan at Jaesaksa Temple, which was built in 2003. Housed inside this shrine hall are a collection of 8 paintings, the Palsangdo murals, but instead of depicting the Buddha's life, they depict the life of the Shilla Korean monk Wanyo Desa. In the first painting, you can see that Wanyo's mother is on her way home, and she gives birth to Wanyo Desa under a chestnut tree, and then she subsequently dies. And his father dies when he's 12, and then his grandfather dies when he's 17. So he has quite a tragic early life. In the second painting, Wanyo has left home and shaved his head at Yongchuisa Temple in Yangsan. He studied at Hwangrongsa Temple. He learned from a monk named Nangja, and he studied at Oosa Temple in Pohang. In the 3rd and 4th painting, you can see what I described before about the Wanyo's life, drinking from the skull that he thought was a delicious water, but was actually putrid, and he vomits after that and comes to his enlightenment. And then afterwards, he gives up the idea of studying abroad, and he stays in the Korean Peninsula, and he learns and studies here. In the 5th painting, after Wanyo attains enlightenment, he comes back home and he makes his home temple, which is called Jogesa Temple, which means open the first door in English. Wanyo approaches war widows and lower ranking people in society and teaches them Namu Amitabha. With this, people can become Buddha-like and enter nirvana with these simple words. In the 6th, you can see Wanyo marries Princess Yosak. In doing this, he became a person that's not quite a monk, but not quite a common person either out of holy orders. In the 7th mural, you can see that Wanyo is not liked by traditional religious society. He's not picked as one of the 100 high-ranking monks to administer over Buddhist memorial service at Hwangrongsa Temple in Gyeongju. However, he is so popular among common people that he quickly gathers a following of 1,000 people. However, they can't ignore Wanyo's knowledge in the 8th painting, and because he is so knowledgeable, especially about the Diamond Sutra, the Buddhist establishment is forced to contact Wanyo so that he can explain this Buddhist teaching. Afterwards, he only continues to grow in popularity until his death. So, now that we've covered the originality and diverse uniqueness found at both historic and modern temples in Korea, you can see that not all Korean temples are the same. In fact, some temples have more differences than they do similarities. So in the end, with a broader knowledge, appreciation, and understanding, it's quite easy to see, both big and small, that no 2 temples are actually the same. So thank you for indulging me and taking the time to listen. I think I went a little bit over. So that's the end, and I'm open to questions.
Dale, thank you very much. This is great. I've already got a question coming in from Cho In Suk. Go ahead, Dr. Cho.
Yeah.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep, we're
Yes,
good.
I can.
Thank you.
Yes. Actually, thank you very much for your inspiring lecture. I would like to ask 3 things. The first one is about the up to 5 gates you mentioned. Can I
Yes.
ask you why you classify the gates up to 5? Because I'm a Buddhist, and also
Yes.
I'm one of the Dharma instructor in Joge order.
Yes.
We classified basically 3 gates, mainly 3 gates, whatever the name is, but the function is mainly 3 gates. That's why I would like to ask you about the 5 gates.
Yes.
The second question is, you mentioned all the Buddha statue as a statue, but as my knowledge, before we have a eye-opening ceremony in a a main hall or whatever the hall.
Yep.
So we call this stage. But after the eye-opening ceremony, we call it image. So Buddha image, but you keep calling it Buddha statue.
Yes.
And the third question was, you showed us three buildings in Tongdosa temple.
Yes.
So, but these three relations, like this Yongsanjeon and all those buildings, actually
Yes.
this relationship between three buildings, for me, is a little bit odd because many Korean scholars classified the Tongdosa temple, so three different areas, but I don't do it because in my dissertation was about three jewel temples in Korea. So please consider these questions. Thank you.
Okay. Hey, no, thank you for the question. Typically, you're right. There are three gates at a Korean temple. What I meant, though, was that they can, overall, there are 5 gates, but they can be taken in and out. So, for example, at Tongdosa Temple, there's the Iljumun, there's the Chonwangmun, and the Bulimun gates. But at other temples, like Magoksa Temple, for example, you'll find only 3 gates, sorry. And you'll find the Iljumun, the Gumgangmun, and the Chonwangmun. There's only 3 gates, but the variation is different.
But the Gumgangmun and Chonangmun, the function is same. This Chonangmun or the Heavenly King's Gate or
Yes.
Guardian's Gate, the guards the Buddha's teaching. What the Buddha they guards what the Buddha taught. So main function is the guardians. The first one is the one pillar gate, whatever the number of the pillar is. Anyway,
Yes.
we call it one pillar gate.
Yes.
And the second one is guardian's gate. So
Yes.
Gumgangmun or Chonangmun or whatever the name is. And the third one is non-dual gate, Burimun or several different names. But the 5 gates, what else other 2 gates function? The question is that one.
Sorry, okay, I misunderstood that. So the Iljumun gate is one pillar gate, which is an idea about that things aren't always what they appear to be, right? That, you know, if you look at a certain angle at the gate, the 2 pillars suddenly become 1 pillar. So it's an idea of perceptionality, that what does it look like isn't always what it actually is. So that's the Iljumun. Then the Gumgang and Chonhwang are, yes, functionally the same. They are guardian gates, but they're interchangeable. You'll find them interchangeably at different temples. And then the Bulimun is the gate of non-duality, which is, you know, when you pass through it, you're supposedly, like, symbolically supposed to free yourself of things like good and evil. There's only oneness. And the Bojeru pavilion is usually like a lecture hall. It's actually a pavilion, but it's usually divided into 2 stories. So you enter through the bottom, and usually the top, it can either be for housing musical instruments or a lecture hall. So it's 3 entry gates / pavilions, and they all can have similar meanings, but they are interchangeably used at different temples.
Yeah.
And as for, you're right about statue. The only reason I'm using statue when describing and not image is because I think in English, it would be confusing if I kept referring to it as image instead of statue, because in English, we have a concept of what image is more like a painting or a picture. So you're right about the actual eye-opening ceremony and the meaning changing. As for Tongdosa, I wasn't sure what you what the question was. So could you clarify?
One of your presentation slides,
Yes.
you showed 3 buildings together, including
Yes.
Yongsanjeon Hall
Yes.
and in the middle,
Yaksajeon.
yeah,
Yes.
Yaksajeon and the other one,
Gurkha. Yes.
yeah, yes. But what kind of connection between three buildings together is my
Okay.
question. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Now I understand. If you look at a lot of, not a lot, some temples like at Pyeongchungsa in Miryang or Jikjisa in Gimcheon, when you look at the main altar, you'll see the three statues. And for those statues, they represent samsara, which is birth, which is yaksa, the sun rising in the east.
Yeah.
And then, so that's where it is physically at Tongdosa, the building. And then in the center, you'll see the Yongsanjeon, which is Vulture Peak, which represents Buddha and life.
Yeah.
And then on the far west, you'll find the Gukrakjeon Hall, which is where Amita is, and that's the sun setting. So it's an actual physical building representation of what you sometimes find in Daejeon halls at like Jikjisa or Pyeongchungsa. So it's architecturally set up to what you sometimes see inside main halls with statues, but instead it's actual buildings.
It's your interpretation, is all.
No. This is.
Can I understand it's your interpretation, or? Because I'm an architect, and my specialty is the Buddhist architecture. And as I already mentioned, Tongdosa is one of my dissertation. It's a part of my dissertation. That's why I want to know what the main point. But I understand what you mean, and thank you very much. Yeah. For your
thank you for the questions.
Yeah.
I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Okay, great. I've got a question from Algie Lacey.
Yes.
He says, if he were listening to a comparable lecture about Christian art, there would be lots of names of painters and sculptors and so on.
Yes.
Can you suggest why Buddhist art is apparently anonymous?
Good question. It's funny. When I go to, like, I've been to so many temples, and when I go to temples, I can spot who a specific artist is just by, like if you were to go see a Picasso or Van Gogh. But remarkably, yes, the names are held absent, especially contemporary-wise. It's the anonymity, I think, of the painting, that it doesn't so much matter who the artist is as it is what it symbolizes. And so that's what I would say about that. But more historically, though, you do see things like statues and paintings that do have historical names on them. And I think I did mention one that with the statue, the Gwansan Bosal at Songgwangsa Temple actually has the name of the artist and the donor inside the statue. So they do actually exist for some of them. It's kind of hit and miss, but what's there and what isn't. Good question.
Okay, Lester, go ahead with your question.
Hi, this has been a real treat. Thank you so much. I've learned more in the last hour about Korean Buddhism than I have in the last 2 years living here.
Great, I'm happy to hear that.
I think maybe some of my students are watching.
Great.
But I was real curious about this relationship between shamanism and Buddhism, and wonder if you could say a little bit more about that. You alluded to it a couple of times. I found it interesting how Buddhism, the Buddhists, when it came into Korea, seemed to sort of adopt some ideas from shamanism into it. And is that still true today? Or is there any effort? Is there any tension between like the Buddhist elites, Buddhist leaders, and the shaman?
So I'll answer the latter part. There is some. If you go to certain temples, I was just at one here in Busan, actually. It's up in the mountains, and it's not very popular, but it's popular enough. And that's usually where you find shamans praying. There's actually 2 in Busan that I've been to in the same mountain range. And they actually have signs up in the Sanshingak, which is the mountain spirit hall, or the Samsungak, which is for the 3 shamans. And they'll actually have a physical sign saying, do not pray here, do not hold your ceremonies here. And I'm not sure if this is because they've had tension before in the past. It's not quite clear, but I would assume, yes, that there has been a bit of tension going on there. As for the history, yeah, it's kind of interesting that, you know, shamanism is very indigenous to Korea. And it's interesting because historically, you know, there's the 3 kingdoms in Korea, and at different times, they accept Buddhism. You know, in the north, Goguryeo and Baekje accept it fairly early on, whereas Shilla holds out for about 150 years, preferring not to give attention to what the commoners are actually starting to worship more and more. As for like how it's absorbed, I think Buddhism and shamanism are very interesting because the Buddhism that first entered into Korea was a very much a cause and effect type of Buddhism. You know, that you do this, you get that. If you're a good person this way, you get this sort of karma. And it's the same with shamanism. You know, if you pray to Sanshin, you get this in turn. So it was very similar in the way that they viewed cosmology and what could happen if you did certain propitiations and things like that. I hope that, does that answer your question? Sorry, I kind of wandered a bit.
I should read the book, right?
Yes, exactly. But thank you for a good question.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Eden, you have a question. Go ahead and unmute your mic and ask.
Yes, I hope you can hear me well. Thank you very much for your interesting talk and also for the beautiful pictures, and thank you for organizing the event. So I have 2 questions, and the first one regards the origin of this most commonly seen temple structure in East Asia, where one would only see 1 pagoda and 1 Buddha hall, right?
Yes.
And I'm asking this question because I'm not a Buddhist art historian or anything, but as far as I know, when you think about the statue, Buddhist statue and Buddhist pagoda,
Yes.
the pagodas have much longer history than the Buddhist statues, because for about 500 years or so after the death of the historical Buddha, the representations of the Buddha was considered too blasphemous.
Yes.
And then because of Gandhara's influence, then the Buddhists also started to make Buddhist statues as well. So that's why I think in many Theravada Buddhist countries, you often see larger pagodas, not any kind of temple structure, Buddha hall, no, or sometimes you just see the Buddha hall inside of a massive pagoda. But that's a different story in East Asia. So I guess it must have origined sometime somewhere in China, but I'm just wondering how or why it's became the way it is now. That's my first question.
Okay.
And then, should I continue or would you like to answer?
Yes, please.
The second question is, I heard at the beginning you visited about 900?
500.
Yeah. So I guess you're the person that visited the most Korean Buddhist temples. So I'm just wondering, I heard that there are about 500 Buddhist military temples in South Korea as well. What I mean by military temples is that they're either in the military camp, so I guess public doesn't really have any access to it, but also you sometimes have military Buddhist temples that are somewhere around the military camps where people can also visit as well. I wonder if you ever had any chance to visit them. If so, did you observe any kind of distinctive features there that you normally don't see in normal Buddhist temples? There are my 2 questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I guess I'll answer the first. The actual architecture of Korean temples actually goes through kind of a metamorphosis. It changes. So early on, if you go to a place like Gyeongju, there's wonderful examples of a centralized pagoda, either one or two, with what they call a bumdang, which is the golden hall. But then slowly over time, it changes from one pagoda to two pagodas, then it changes to more halls. And then later on, the importance of the pagoda is still important, but the material that's used for the pagoda changes. It changes from always with rock, but different types of rock, brick rock. So you'll see a different change within architecture. I was just this past weekend at Gyeongju, and I was looking at Bunhwangsa, which is a wonderful example of a very rare style of pagoda, which is a brick pagoda. I think I've only ever seen 3 of these styles. And they're Baekje, which is the northern part, which is Shaluksa Temple, and Songnimsa Temple, and Bunhwangsa Temple. But then they switch, originally in India, they're more of like a wooden material because that's what's common. But in Korea, rock is common. So it changes material that way. And then as time goes on, the expansion of Mahayana Buddhism with bodhisattvas grow as well, whereas you said Theravada doesn't have that many images, whereas bodhisattvas just explode in Korea. And you see many physical interpretations of different Buddhas and bodhisattvas. So it's a whole transition over hundreds of years, and it's really interesting to see the architecture and artistry change over that time. As for military camps and military temples, I haven't seen any like contemporary ones. I'm not sure if you mean contemporary or historically. I have seen a historical one, which was in Gosong, I believe. And the pavilion that's usually there, you can enter under it, the Bojeru pavilion, and then on top is a lecture hall. But for this one, it actually, it was kind of a defensive barrier, and that you had to actually walk around the pavilion to gain entrance. And it was a very narrow entrance. And this is after the Imjin War of 1592. So that's the only one that I know historically, but I'm not sure about any contemporary, if that's what you meant.
Okay, thank you very much. If I may just add one small question on the first question.
Yes.
I was just wondering, so the reason why I asked the question is, so when you think about the Theravada Buddhist temples, where they usually look like pagodas, and that's how it was originally done, so after around 500 years after the death of the Buddha. But when you look at the East Asian Buddhist temples, in a way, people are paying respect to 2 Buddhas because there's one Buddha, at least one Buddha statues in a Buddha hall, and there's a pagoda that was originally the representation of the Buddha. So it's kind of redundant. So you might say.
Yes. Oh, now I get your question better. Sorry. So in Korea, there's actually very few, historically, the Buddha's remains were housed inside of pagodas. And then as they travel further east, there's just not that much left of the Buddha to give to pagodas because they're already housed inside pagodas. As you go east, there are just in Tongdosa, for example, yes, there are pagodas, but there's nothing inside the pagoda of the Buddha. It's just a symbol. Whereas they actually do have the physical remains, partial physical remains of the Buddha, and they don't have any altar statues at the Daeungjeon Hall, which is the main hall. So the temple just the pagoda just becomes a symbol of the Buddha, and they actually do have the physical remains of the Buddha as well. Whereas you're right, more contemporary pagodas and then statues, I guess you could see it as, yes, a bit redundant, but at the same time, there's nothing wrong with praying to many things, I guess.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We've had a really interesting evening and some excellent questions. Note in your group chat window, Lester's put up the, was it Lester or was it somebody else?
Lester's nodding his head, I think.
I'm having to try and follow everything that's going on. I've got a friend here, David Tizard writes, I'm currently in the small village of Wundong, above the 38th parallel. There's a Buddhist temple and a place of Buddhist worship located inside the military apartment complex here. While I'm not an expert and can't speak for any of the technicalities, it's very similar to the ones you see elsewhere in the countryside. So, you know, we have a little bit of information. Most of us civilians wouldn't easily be able to gain access to Korean military bases.
Yes.
But I do know from friends who have served in the military and have been chaplains' assistants that there are Buddhist monks as chaplains in Korean military bases, as well as Catholic priests and Protestant ministers. So they, you know, the military chaplaincy serves all those communities and probably more. I don't know all the lists. So, but yeah, very, very interesting, Dale. Thank you. You've put a lot of work into your life here, or a lot of life into your work. I'm not quite sure how to say that.
Sometimes a bit of both.
and for many, it's a lot of both. So again, thank you for being with us, and we really appreciate that.